Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cordell Carter, and welcome to the Socrates Program webinar, Thinking About National Security and the Global Supply Chain. We are extremely excited today to welcome Dina Temple-Raston, Special Correspondent at National Public Radio, and Harvey Richtikoff, Director of Policy and Cybersecurity Research at the University of Washington for today's event. Please be sure to write any questions you may have in the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of your stream, and Harvey and Dina will be answering questions towards the end of their conversation. Thank you so much and enjoy the show.
All right, can you hear us?
Yes, we're unmuted by the host.
Great. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar.
This is Harvey.
I'm Harvey. This is Dina
Temple-Raston.
And what we're going to talk about is the supply chain issue. The supply chain issue used to be a rather esoteric topic. When we put together a Deliver Uncompromised with MITRE, it was mostly focused on the defense industrial base. And it had rather more, I would say, specialized conversation group. And then we've had some supply chain issues with food. But I think the COVID-19 crisis has really brought to the fore this question of supply chain. And when we wrote with Roger George, the National Security Enterprise, a number of years ago, we had nothing on supply chain as being an existential threat, either to the defense industrial base or to our existence in general. But we weren't alone in that, because if you look at the Global Risk Report of 2019 for the World Economic Forum, they list out what they believe were the 10 risks with the most likelihood of having a dramatic impact for global risk. And the 10 risks they listed were extreme weather events, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, natural disasters, data fraud or theft, cyber attacks, man-made environmental disasters, large-scale involuntary migration, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, water crises, and asset bubbles in a major economy. So it's kind of fascinating that they had no real focus on what we're experiencing now with the pandemic. And before I turn the issue over to Dina, we thought, well, how does one define supply chain? And the defense industrial base and DoD always has definitions, but we thought we would do a more generic definition. And the generic definition we're going to be working with for this webinar is: a supply chain is the network of all the individuals, organizations, resources, activities, and technology involved in the creation and sale of a product, from the delivery of source materials, from the supplier to the manufacturer, through to its eventual delivery to the end user. The supply chain segment involved with getting the finished product from the manufacturer to the consumer is known as the distribution channel. So, Dina, what would you say are some of the issues that our current crisis has sort of generated for us?
Well, it's interesting when you talk about this idea of the distribution channel and recognizing that there appears to be a gap between what we need and what we can supply, particularly when it comes to, for example, testing in the COVID-19 pandemic. Interestingly, South Korea recognized that there was a problem in the supply chain during the SARS crisis in 2003. And it had a very similar problem to what we're having. China was struggling with the disease as well, and it stopped exporting the chemicals or reagents that were needed for tests to see who had SARS and who didn't. And because of that, South Korea realized that they had to secure access for their own citizens, because if China was the one who was producing this, if the supply chain was coming from China, if they needed to, would simply not deliver and keep everything for its citizens on the mainland. So what ended up happening is South Korea ended up taking all these building blocks of tests and actually bringing them essentially in-house. And so they could produce their own and wouldn't have to depend on anyone else. And they stockpiled these tests. And that's why they have excess capacity. And that's why we've seen, for example, Maryland be able to buy 500,000 COVID tests from them, because South Korea had realized decades ago almost that there was a supply chain problem when it came to medicines.
So when you say that the South Koreans had gamed it, I think that we have to be quite clear that it isn't as if we in the United States had not played similar games. So at the War College, when I was the dean there, we actually had a number of war games post-SARS and post-Ebola. And we had everyone, understand that this is going to be a major potential problem, and that we had severe issues at critical junctures for having the appropriate resources for us to put them into the fight. And in fact, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration had generated these games, had created stockpiles, but as a result of a number of policy trade-offs that in the end have now proven to be fatal for us, they did not have a process in which all of the products that we would need would then be in supply to place in an emergency. So, Dino, what would you say was why South Korea had the stockpile? How do you explain that issue for how we were attempting to think through, if we did have a pandemic, how we'd respond to it through the structures?
Well, let's explain a little bit what the stockpile is actually supposed to do, because I think that's become a little twisted in the telling as the Trump administration talks about it. And the stockpile was never meant to be all-encompassing. It was always supposed to be a stopgap measure that could help states get through a limited amount of time while the Defense Production Act ramped up production of whatever was needed. And when Harvey talked about trade-offs, what the trade-offs were, in some cases, were completely understandable. So for example, one of the things that they did is they stockpiled smallpox vaccines. And they did this as opposed to stockpiling, say, PPE, which we're all talking about now. And you can understand the logic. The logic was it takes a long time to produce enough smallpox vaccines, but with the DPA, it really isn't that hard to refashion factories so that they're developing, so that they can produce masks and gowns and gloves and everything you need in terms of PPE. So that kind of trade-off made sense. Another thing that happened is after H1N1, the stockpile was depleted and it really wasn't built up again. So as a result, we're sort of seeing that problem now. Finally, let me talk a little bit about the CDC and the tests, because I think that that is a little bit confusing as well. Because one of the things that I thought immediately when the CDC test didn't work is, why aren't they just using the World Health Organization test? They had one. Well, this is the way traditionally it's been done. The World Health Organization test is typically for developing countries. And when there have been these various strains and viruses that have happened, a standard operating procedure for the CDC was to develop their own test. And you may have heard something about the pandemic playbook. This was a playbook that, among other people, Lisa Monaco helped put together for the Obama administration. And within the pandemic playbook, they never really thought about what would happen if the CDC's test failed. That just wasn't something that they gamed out. It had never been a problem before, and it was only a problem this one time. And it's not that the WHO test was inferior. It's not sort of an America First idea of the Trump administration. It just simply was never done that way. And the idea was that even though the CDC test with these reagents didn't work, they figured it wouldn't take very long for the CDC to sort of tweak the test and get it out to everybody. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. And that's put us in the test problem that we have now, which we'll talk a little bit about later.
So one of the issues that Dina's highlighted was there was this idea that we had the Defense Production Act, which I think many of you have now heard about, and that Defense Production Act gave extraordinary powers to the federal government to harness and organize the private sector. So we have in the United States, for the lawyers out there, they would know that we have quite an extensive legal framework that gives both the federal government and the states extraordinary power to respond to emergencies. We have the National Emergency Act. Once the president declares a national emergency, it triggers a range of federal authorities. We have the Public Health Service Act, which has also been triggered under Section 319. It allows the HHS secretary to determine that a public health emergency exists, which again triggers extraordinary powers under federal authority. We have the Stafford Act, and many of you have heard the Stafford Act. It usually is triggered when we have a natural disaster, such as a hurricane in one of the states. And that allows the feds to pay for a variety of resources on behalf of the state. So the idea that we need more laws is not really an issue here. The issue that I think was always contemplated by all of our emergency plans for supply chain issues is that the federal government would be able to harness the private sector, to focus the private sector, to step up and to provide the needs that we needed. What's become patently apparent is our dependency in these supply chains on foreign entities. And those foreign entities have now resulted in a strategic vulnerability that has been laid bare for the first time for the entire public. And the issues going forward are going to be, how do we, in post-COVID-19, think through what the supply chain should be, vis-a-vis being less global and perhaps more centralized and more local, as we figure out diversity questions and resiliency as being the watchwords for what makes for an important supply chain process.
And just a word about DPA. DPA does more than just compel companies to put the government at the front of the line when it comes to what they're producing. It also provides loans. It provides contract guarantees. So if you're going to produce, say, 50 million N95 masks, that the government will actually buy all of those and guarantee that they won't sort of sit in your particular warehouse. So there are all these other sort of parts to the DPA. And it's a little bit mysterious as to whether or not why the DPA hasn't been evoked in the way that we thought it would be. So let's talk a little bit about testing capacity. So the Trump administration has been really focused on this idea of capacity. And if you've been watching some of these different press conferences that President Trump has had, you've seen that there have been these maps where he says, look, here's Maryland. Here are all the testing sites that there are in Maryland. How can Maryland possibly say that it doesn't have enough tests? Look at the capacity. Well, he's slightly changing the subject, because the subject isn't testing capacity. It was for a little while, whether labs could actually produce things fast enough. But the problem is really a supply chain problem. And let me explain why. So there are a handful of companies that can actually do these COVID tests. There are more and more companies that come on board. I think they're up to 30 now, but the big ones, there are about 5 big ones, okay? And the most famous of which is now Abbott Labs, right? This is the small machine that President Trump took out of the box in the Rose Garden and said, this is a game changer. It can give you a test in 15 minutes. Well, the interesting thing about that Abbott Labs machine is, from my reporting, what I understand is that Abbott Labs machine made it into the White House because they were going to test officials around the president. And when the president saw, oh, wow, this is a 15-minute test, he grabbed the machine and made it a prop for his press conference. The problem with the Abbott machine is that it can do one test in 15 minutes, but that particular machine can't do a battery of tests, which is what you would need to sort of get the level of tests up to the level you need it to test enough people to reopen. There's another problem, and that is the problem that each one of these different companies has a different set of chemicals, a different set of swabs. Every component part that gets you to a positive or negative COVID test is tailored for that particular machine. Makes perfect sense, really. There's a cartridge for the Abbott machine, and they want you to buy their cartridges. They don't want you to buy some generic cartridge or somebody else's cartridge. So as a result, you have a supply chain interruption that's not just like one particular thing that you can focus on to, say, ramp up production for, but all kinds of little small component parts they can't get. So for example, swabs, right? Seems easy enough. The president actually held up a swab and a Q-tip during one of his press conferences at the White House. And he said, how difficult is this? It's a swab. Well, it turns out that the swab actually has chemicals in it that are particular to the test. So you can't just use a Q-tip. You can't just mass produce the swabs because there's something very particular about the swab. And then another of the problems is some of the reagents or the chemicals that they use to figure out whether someone is COVID positive or negative, some of these chemicals come from overseas, and in many cases from China. So the problem we're having is not a problem of capacity. The problem we're having is a very basic supply chain problem. And what the people I've talked to have wondered about is, why couldn't you do something like, let's say you decide you want the Abbott test, and I'm using this as a hypothetical. You could use the DPA to force Abbott to license out what they have in the test so other people could produce it, and then you could have mass production. And that hasn't happened. And this gets to the point that Harvey was hinting at earlier, which is this isn't really just a local supply chain problem. This is an international one.
So I think one of the reasons we wanted you to read, and I think it's posted, the testimony of Rosemary Gibson, who is one of the co-authors of China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine, is this has become a structural issue that has clearly demonstrated our long-term vulnerability on some critical infrastructure questions. Her testimony was on October 30th, 2019. It was before the Committee on Energy and the Commerce Subcommittee on Health. And her opening statement is that the US is dependent on China for penicillin and many other life-saving antibiotics and generic medicines. The United States, quote, can no longer make penicillin. In 2004, the last US penicillin fermentation plant in Syracuse, New York, announced it was closing. Just think of what has happened. We have been the sort of the consensus of the way we understood the market was that we would shift production to lower cost entities. And that would be a more efficient way of understanding the world global supply. That is now demonstrating in a situation that we are experiencing with the pandemic, that the world global supply has made us extraordinarily vulnerable. So what we're experiencing now is, this starts as a supply chain problem, which starts as a health crisis, which some people have pointed out. It then becomes a humanitarian crisis affecting the world. It then morphs into, now what we're experiencing, an economic employment crisis that will rival, appears, the Great Depression. And in the end, that results into, finally, a moral crisis. We are actually the situation that people are confronting with the shortages of sometimes choosing who can live and who will die. This is an extraordinary moral issue that we as a democratic state have to start working our way through, because we are demonstrating that the supply chain results in what we have, which is a market failure. And if we do not have the appropriate political solutions, like the exercising of federal power and state power, like Defense Production Act, we will be reconstituting how we understand what it means to be safe anymore in the United States or in the Western world or around the rest of the world.
And this was a problem that you could have seen coming. So to give you an idea, one of the examples we use about this break in supply chain, or the fact that we've exported a lot of this production, is the blood thinning drug heparin. So they use it in kidney dialysis and surgeries and other critical care to prevent blood clots, and which could trigger a heart attack or a stroke. And at that time, so in the 2007, China controlled about half the world's supply of the active ingredient in heparin. And there was a bad batch, and it started killing people in the United States. And then about a year later, there were hearings on the Hill and calls to have the FDA shift all these investigations or inspections that they do in Europe to shift those inspections to China, which had virtually no oversight whatsoever. There were about 700 plants making key ingredients for generics and things like penicillin and heparin in China, and there had been inspections of something in the neighborhood of 15. And what ended up happening is, because so much of this had been exported to China, the US never ended up doing those inspections because they were worried that if it cracked down on China, it would actually spark a shortage of heparin.
So we don't want to just leave you with a sense of bleakness. We think that there are public policy solutions in the post-COVID-19 world. And we'll just sort of sketch them out quickly here. Maybe in the Q&A we'll be able to elaborate more fully. But in the Gibson testimony, which you have, she recommends 8 recommendations for us to go forward to sort of bring back our capability to control our own fate in this world of the pharmaceuticals. Also, since we all agree that going forward, resiliency and diversity are the watchwords in order for us to not have vulnerable supply chains, clearly some of the solutions will be technological. I'm involved in a group called Make or Mask, and what they're doing is trying to harness the 3D community, 3D manufacturing community, to be able to make masks locally. And they've been able to get NIH approval, and they're supplying the masks in the Seattle area. And the idea of local production, using those resources, is the problem is always, can we do this on scale? And do we prepare ourselves for this type of sense of stress? The other major issue that's come aboard, which has become quite, I would say, controversial a bit, is the idea of the Google Apple idea of being able to use location data, right, for basically the test and trace.
For contact tracing.
And for contact tracing. Now that has become an intriguing technological solution. People have already started talking about whether or not we're going to have a pandemic act.
Like a Patriot Act, but for the pandemic.
To figure out what to do, because the public privacy issues that are raised by these applications kind of strike at the very heart of what we understand as privacy and the relationship of the citizen to the state. And Glenn Gerstle, another old friend, has written a white paper saying
Glenn Gerstle used to be
the general counsel at the NSA. And he said, look, clearly the technology is going to be harnessed. As you know, Israel has put an app out. Singapore has put an app out. People like Stu Baker have written extensively now why we should be exploiting these technologies. But just some of the concepts that we're going to have to think about is, what is the scope of the collection that we're going to allow? Who's going to collect it, analyze it, and maintain the data? Who's going to be permitted to have access to the data? What kind of searches are you going to be allowed to do? How are we going to store the data, and will that data be encrypted in a way that cannot be easily accessed? And will there be the appropriate political public reporting and independent oversight And will we have the appropriate legal restrictions around the data so we feel comfortable? And some people have mentioned that we may need to use an NGO, a non-government organization like the National Science Foundation, an independent scientific entity that people will feel more comfortable with.
So what we have in New York is we've just, it was announced yesterday that Bloomberg Philanthropies was going to come together with Johns Hopkins University and Virtual Science, I think is the name of the company, which is a company that does a lot of the general healthcare. And they're going to come together, and for the 6 or 7 states that are, sorry, for the tri-state region, so that's New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, they're going to try and figure out a tracking system or an ability to figure out what the connections are between people who test positive for COVID in that area. And the question is whether or not what will be done with that information. And the reason why it was done with Bloomberg Philanthropies and Johns Hopkins was to address some of these very issues that Harvey just brought up.
So, but we're kind of rounding it up because I see we're getting close to 3 o'clock. Part of this issue, though, with the supply chain sort of brings us back to what has been a rather more prominent supply chain problem or issue, which concerns 5G. And those of you on the call who follow the telecommunications issues know that we've had a series of issues with Huawei, with Kaspersky, with ZTE, making it clear that we don't believe that those entities, because they're closely tied to the Chinese government and to the fact that all Chinese corporations in the end are at the behest of the Chinese government, should be at the backbone of our telecommunications networks. So as you can imagine, this becomes particularly intriguing when and if you think of, if we're going to put together the notion of the Google, Apple apps all riding on the internet service providers, all riding potentially in the future on 5G networks, that these networks will have access to adversaries who will control ultimately the networks, in the sense of you may have a clear network now, but our concern is when you do your famous updates, you lose control of your network, you lose control of your platform, and then whoever controls that update can, with the appropriate malware, actually gain control of the actual platform, network, or asset.
So imagine if the Chinese and the Russians actually had the location of every American available to them because they had just hacked into the system.
So what we're looking at this issue is that it isn't just about manufacturing, it isn't just about the private sector. I think what we're learning, and this crisis has brought this to the fore, is that the supply chain is an existential question and threat to how we're going to understand what ultimately is going to be the social contract that we have both with the government and the private sector. And I think what's significant is, as we move forward, the pandemic has made it very clear in the post-pandemic world, we will probably need to look at very carefully new types of legislation that enable us to feel comfortable, A, with the way we've set the parameters left and right for privacy, and B, that we feel comfortable that we've helped to identify what are the critical supply chains that we need to lock down to make sure that we will be able to respond to the next crisis in a manner that allows us to buy us enough time to then be able to develop and produce wherever we have the shortages. It's an extraordinary time for all of us. I want to particularly thank Aspen for being able to bring this forum together and doing what the forums they are. I think we're all Zooming, and Zooming, as you know, is another supply chain problem. We sort of recommend to you the study that was done by Citizens Lab, the Monk Institute up in Canada. They've done the best open source non-classified analysis of our very vehicle called Zoom, and the deep potential problems with the ability for, quote, Zoom bombing, and or people having access to the waiting room that is not controlled by the actual group that's controlling the Zoom application. Again, another supply chain issue because of the fact that a significant number of the coding, I think the Institute says 40% of the coding is taking place in China, which is not under our authority or control. Just another extraordinary level of why the supply chain issue, as we defined, is becoming one of the core existential threats for ourselves in communication. Cordell, I think we're actually at 301 or 302 as we agreed, and we're gonna.
We'd love to take some questions.
All the hard questions will go to Dina. I will take all the easy questions, Cordell.
Great, and I thank you all so much. We have a few questions here in the Q&A, but I will exert some host privilege here and ask my question first. You know, what is it going to take, in your opinion, if not the present situation, for us to, as a country, to build policy and put systems in place that will protect us, not when it's an acute issue, but actually do some long-term planning? Is this finally it? 50,000 dead and more counting? Or do you think we won't get there in a generation or so?
Go ahead. That was an easy one. Go ahead, Harvey.
I would say that we all would agree of our cohort. None of us, except for maybe Doug Thomas, were alive for the first attack in 1908.
1918?
1918, the Spanish flu, other than Doug. But I think that we lived through 9/11. And 9/11 clearly had a dramatic impact on a whole set and range of the way we interacted and the way the national security state asserted itself. I think we're going to have a similar reaction to this pandemic. There will be similar types of legislation that are going to come forward. And we're going to have to say, Cordell, when I think asked when we part of the dialogue, what is the most appropriate way for us to do this with maintaining our core democratic institutions and our core values?
And what we learned from 9/11 is that we tend to overcompensate, right? Overswing. So how much is the overswing going to be this time, given the breadth of this and how it has touched so many parts of this country and the world?
An example will be in the solutions that Google and Apple are putting forward. There already are solutions coming forward technologically that what would happen is the app that you would have on your phone, let's say, would be always beaming out code as to who's around you. But that code would be constantly changing. So if it turned out that, Cordell, you were found to have COVID-19 and we would go back to see who your phone had been close to, those would all be coded. We wouldn't know the actual identity. It would be actually encrypted. And then whoever was the entity that had the ability to contact those individuals, they might be able to contact them, but it would be encrypted and they might not even know who they are, but they would know that they'd be able to contact those phones that were close in vicinity for you. So there are ways of thinking of going forward using the technology, but at the same time maintaining privacy.
Right.
But there's always a trade-off, right? We had that after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, and there's going to be how much privacy are you willing to give up to ensure that you're not a carrier of COVID-19 or that you haven't been exposed to it.
And as you know, China has clearly moved very aggressively in their social rating and for individuals, and the cameras being used and the ability to give you a credit score based on your citizenship score on a variety of activities. Ironically, are we moving in a similar direction, but hoping that we'll be able to use our values to make the state less intrusive and protect some sphere of privacy, I think is going to be the challenge for the 21st century.
Great. So let me hit some questions from Q&A. They're really coming in now. This is from Paul. If diversity is key to our future supply chain security, what is the US government's role in encouraging industry to find alternate sources and suppliers outside of China or countries under China's influence?
Thank you, Paul. I think what we would say to that is, and I'll, unless you want to go
No,
first,
you go first.
is that we're probably going to have to think through how we understand the defense industrial base, let's take that as an example, and what is the chains of construction that we have that are going to allow us to have specific alternatives when we realize that there's a certain commodity that's going to prove to be critical in that particular platform that has to be renewable over time as we use it up. The example I'll give you, early in the war when we went to Iraq, we began to see in Afghanistan and Iraq that the phones we were using a particular type of battery. We had never thought we would need a huge supply of those batteries because we never expected that our military engagements, it's hard to imagine at that time, but we never expected they would last long. We thought they'd be short exchanges in which we would quickly defeat the enemy and not need to have this huge supply of radios for long periods of time. It turned out that we did need those radios for long periods of time. It turned out that the batteries were being produced by a very small company that could not actually deal with the demand given what was happening for their use. So we went back and said, okay, we used the DPA and we blew up the battery production so we would not be vulnerable. We need to do that in a more analytical way as we walk through, Paul, what are the critical tools and platforms that we will need in the future and what supplies those critical tools and platforms. We're saying that's exactly what we think some university affiliated research councils or federally funded groups, we need to start having studies of that kind to go forward. Because remember, before COVID-19, the issue that we all were talking about was artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Yeah.
That AI ML, right, was the issue. Well, that hasn't gone away. So how do we harness that type of AI and ML in order to make us more resilient is going to be a very fascinating question.
And building on that, I think also that there's the idea that there are new technologies that I don't think we even thought about when they were putting together the pandemic playbook. 3D printing at that time was just about, the concern was just that 3D printers would be used to make guns that we couldn't detect. No one thought about a 3D printing sort of community that could pitch in. And there are over 1 million 3D printers in the United States. So imagine, you wouldn't even need to, or let's say you're in Africa and you have 3D printers there that are local. You wouldn't need to ship things, right? It would be local. Right. So there are new, and this is the cool thing about the United States, right? Is that there's always this new technology that people hadn't thought of that have this new kind of component. And in this case, Maker Mask and all these masks that they got approved by the NIH is an example of how you can fix that. I mean, we've seen lots on the news about the hobbyist who decided to help the local hospital by printing out these 3D masks. But there's a greater ability to harness people in various places that maybe they hadn't thought of 5 years ago.
If you do on scale, and of course, the 3D, remember, as Dina said, there is a Second Amendment issue with the 3D printers and the printing of guns. So there's a lot of litigation that was generated about, do you have a First Amendment right to use that code to be able to print a gun, or is that a violation because there's no serial and it can't be registered number? So every time our legal framework deals with one of these new solutions, there's going to be, thankfully, the lawyers will have to be involved to see whether or not we could actually have the appropriate legal framework given all these innovative policy developments.
Yeah, and the journalists will help them think through it.
Yes. I'm going to combine two questions here, one from Rob Walker and one from Richard Cooper. So Rob's question starts, so do you all see a need for a supply chain czar, or is it DoD or NSC or CIA? Are they, I'm sorry, CISA? Are they going to have the appropriate oversight and authorities to guide the public-private partnership on this issue? And then to Richard's, what is the immediate response? Who owns the immediate response to the supply chain issues?
So I think it's great. So the first issue is, the American public policy solution to any issue is to create a czar. That has been one of the historic ways, and the idea, I think, less per se than a czar. If you look at the way we had constructed the games that we created for these issues of supply chain, you really need an appropriate coordinated council that combines both the appropriate individuals from the government, both state and federal, and the private sector. This really requires a council to sit together and say, okay, if we're going to have the example that Dina raised of we need to figure out what to do for the machines that test, and if it's going to turn out to be company A, and company A, the critical element is a cartridge, and that cartridge has a certain number of chemicals in it. Let's think through, if we're going to think through about how to do this en masse and scale, what would be the preconditions with which companies, which chemical companies? Let's walk through, because as this is an opportunity for America to be the supply chain for the world. We win World War II because we become the arsenal of democracy. The old joke is that when they asked the Russians in World War II, who beat you? Famous Russian generals said, oh, the American generals. And the Americans said, yes, our American generals are brilliant. And the Russian goes, no, General Electric, General Motors, all of the jet that produced en masse so much materiel that we were able to wipe out the German military, not with our strength, because we could send so many planes against them. We really need to think through, now that we've gone through the SARS, we've gone through Ebola, we now have this pandemic. What are the supply chains? What are the supply companies that have to be organized by both the government and the private sector? That's sort of the critical, not a czar. And if you remind us, what was Richard's part of that question? Cooper's part.
Richard was asking who owns the response, private or public sector?
And my answer, what would you say?
I would say it's a combination. I mean, I think that what's been really odd about this particular response to this pandemic has been the normal channels that they're used to using. FEMA, then DoD does the logistics, and so on and so forth. They haven't been working that way. And FEMA came very late. HHS was taking the lead in the beginning, as opposed to calling in FEMA right away. And you're actually hearing from FEMA on the ground, hey, we're waiting to be tasked. And the right people are not tasking them. So the system itself seems to have not been utilized in the way that we would have expected.
And as I always say, the federal government that we love, it actually doesn't make anything. Right. The federal government does, everything is made by the private sector. So we cannot actually do and produce tangible manufactured goods unless we have the private sector deeply involved in that process. And at the same level, we don't write the code for our computers. We are buying those codes. The clouds are provided to us by the private sector. We clearly have to coordinate and work with the private sector for us to be efficient. But as is pointed out, the private sector isn't per se American, right? If you go to Silicon Valley, they don't see themselves as being an American company. They see themselves as having a world product.
Right.
This is becoming a very fascinating issue because those world products are being, I would say, constrained in certain authoritarian regimes. And we have to decide how we're going to use those products to see whether or not they will fit in the long term the American national interest.
You're engaged.
Sorry. We're very popular. We're getting called in. We're
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
I think the other thing too is it has to do with efficiencies, and clearly people have moved a lot of the production. Say, for example, penicillin. There's no more penicillin. The component parts of penicillin are produced here in the United States. The component parts for heparin are barely produced here in the United States, and it was all because of cost, right? Because it was cheaper. But what has turned out to happen, and this is not China bashing, this is just the reality of what happened, is the Chinese government would subsidize Chinese companies to basically bring in these component parts at the lowest possible cost. Companies companies in the U.S. are public companies. They're looking for the lowest possible cost. They buy there, or their producers who are in the United States are so undercut by the Chinese production, they go out of business, and then China then hikes up the price. And they've done that for one thing after another that are components in our medical supply chain. So is the answer that there's a certain amount of the medical supply chain that needs to be at home to compensate for this? Those are the kinds of trade-offs. It's not inefficiencies. It's just, look, do we really want to think that all our penicillin, if we need it and we get in a fight with China, we suddenly don't have it?
Right. Well,
It's a
isn't that what
whole-
Korea did? I mean, Korea said, we're not going to have this situation again where you control supply to a very important product. We're going to do it.
They brought it in-house, even though it had some inefficiencies.
Right.
It seems to have really paid off for them when it comes to COVID-19.
Yeah. I suspect it's cheaper to make missiles in China, but we make them here. I'm just saying.
Well, there is a group that's actually doing a 3D missile construction, rocket construction.
Oh my goodness.
And just think of the revolution in manufacturing. If you can use that localized way of production to make yourself more resilient, that will be a fascinating wave of the future if we can do that on scale.
Or imagine if 3D printing was already part of the pandemic playbook. So they said, okay, we've run out of PPE. We're going to mobilize these people to start getting this to you while we wait to ramp up, 3M or whoever.
And we've stockpiled all the manufacturing requirements, the plastic sheets that we're going to be able to ram out the shields for you at an extraordinary rate.
Right. So here's a question from Catherine Spies about the number of just new players that are in the PPE space acting as intermediaries. And we just spoke about how the government's job is to essentially coordinate and curate responses from others, be they products or feedback on things. Is it the government's job to be quality control on these products and given all these different actors trying to get PPE to healthcare providers?
Well, it's interesting, just using Maker Mask as an example. Before they got NIH sort of approval, what they assumed is as they were making it, waiting for the approval, that these would be really good masks that you could give to people, the clinicians who were actually taking the swabs, as opposed to the surgeons or as opposed to the people who were inside the emergency room. So there's sort of a staging that you could do. So there would be more PPE, more of the approved PPE available for those people who were in those critical roles, while the people who were also using the same PPE who were in less critical or less dangerous roles could use this other thing while they were waiting for it to be approved.
So we've always had independent certification, particularly of pharmaceutical products, healthcare products, right? You always need an entity that's able to test the product quickly and then say it is good for the following functions. You need an independent authority to do that you trust. Because as you know, and sadly, there have been a lot of scams going on during the COVID-19.
Yes.
And people are exploiting those scams to exploit people's fear. The other element of this crisis that we've seen experience for the first time is the level of, unfortunately, it's quite popular, of false news or the weaponization of information, the spreading of false rumors, the use of social media. That's another huge element that's become part of the modern age and has a dramatic impact on moving people. So, there's a lot of speculation as to who is behind the organizing of groups to protest the closing of our different states and wanting to open them up more sooner. Well, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of fourth estate reporting about who actually was behind that social media, and does it appear to be a bit of manipulation rather than a truly spontaneous grassroots effort.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
this is from the audience as well. What policies should we as voters be pushing our federally elected officials, and I will add state elected officials as well, to pursue right now?
What would you say?
You go ahead.
So what I think that's important is that when you look at the communication in a crisis, we have to focus on facts and data, which some of the governors have made it their leitmotif about communication. There has to be a way to objectively produce those numbers and data that we feel they're not being cooked. Because unless we get a realistic view of how many people have died, who has the virus, have they survived it, have they been quarantined, we need these accurate numbers for us to be able to go forward to bring our economy back online.
And this isn't a hypothetical, right? I mean, it's very interesting how much, even if you're not living in New York, which we do part-time, how many people are actually following Governor Andrew Cuomo's press conferences.
Yeah.
And the reason why he's sort of hitting every box when you talk about, he's frank with the numbers, he says what you do and don't know, he explains how the tests work, he explains what they're doing in terms of testing to figure out who has it, he gives you the numbers even though it's bad news, he admits to mistakes.
Yeah.
Macron in France got a huge bump in popularity as soon as he admitted that he didn't do the right thing at the beginning of the COVID crisis there. We've seen the same thing with Merkel. You can really see how and empathy is a really important thing.
Yeah.
And Cuomo has provided that too. So it's not a hypothetical of what we expect from our federal leaders. I think we're seeing what works and what doesn't, both internationally and here at home, in terms of what are the component parts that people need during times of uncertainty.
And, for good or bad, like many of you, I'm sure we're all glued to CNN to see what the latest toll is for what's happening around the world and the United States. I think we crave information that's accurate. And we also crave for a clear statement of what the policies are going to be going forward that we will have confidence in.
So here's one that's kind of general, but let's assume that there's a massive pivot away from China as being such a key player in our global supply chain. Where do we go? Do we go to Latin America? Is it East Asia? Well, I mean, what are the other likely landing places for, cheap but controllable manufacturing of key components?
Right. So the answer is yes. And I think the key is, are we willing to create reliable change through Latin America, through Africa, through Europe, that are resilient? And that's where a world investment would be important. And everyone is always looking for development strategies that will make countries viable. We have presented to us on a platter, we need to, let's say, take penicillin. Well, which countries should be able to start creating and developing the ability to produce these, the building blocks for penicillin that we would say, and also we're willing to pay a fair price for it, not the lowest price. So one of the biggest issues that become driving everything to the lowest price has ultimately become a huge advantage for countries that are going to specialize on low price production. Well, it's just not low price production, it's also enforcing cartel rules. It's also enforcing antitrust rules. It's also enforcing intellectual property rules. But we should be able to say, at this point, I would think that if you're looking, let's say, Abbott and that cartridge and for speed, we should say, is that the only company that should have that capability? Should we, the government could say, we should make that patent licensed. Other companies should be pay for that, but let's not be solely dependent on these one entities. Let's spread the license. And if you want, you could give the license to a company in Africa or in Latin America if you were willing to lock down the controls to make sure that the production process met the standards that we think we required for those products.
Great. So here's the last question. This is back to an observation that both of you all made about 3D printing. This is from Douglas. Dina, earlier you made a good observation regarding 3D printing capabilities and capacity. And I just wonder, I think Doug is wondering, are we moving in a direction where there'll be a lot more use and coordination of 3D printers as based on what COVID will do in the fall? Meaning, will we just start hyper overproducing these million 3D printers around the country now, planning for another massive outbreak come the fall?
What do you think?
I think what COVID post-19, Doug, is going to do is that we're going to start to rethink how we actually manufacture in the United States. And that, yes, some might be 3D printers, some might be distributed, much smaller batch. Inject molding is another major way of sort of mass producing. I think this crisis is going to make us rethink the manufacturing process to make it as resilient and as diverse as we can. And both the federal government is going to help shape that with contracts, but also even the private sector might say, you know, do we really want to rely on getting this shipment from China? We should start thinking about having our own domestic manufacturers for these key products, and we'll be willing to pay a little bit more, and will the consumer be paying a little bit more? Because what you're paying for is ultimately resilience and the ability to control your own fate.
And I think one of the things that's really going to change is margins, right? So back in the old days when we talked about just-in-time manufacturing, the problem with just-in-time manufacturing was that if there was a break in that supply chain, then sort of everything stopped, right? Because you didn't have a stockpile of it. And so I think what will end up happening ahead of the fall is that we have now information about what we really need. Before a pandemic, it was sort of an ethereal thing that we wondered what we would need, and also it seemed like it was happening everywhere else, but not here.
So yeah, I'll end as my father used to say. He's very upset I didn't become a tax lawyer. Everything comes back to the tax code.
Right.
So if you want to build in supply and excess capacity, give you a tax credit. Right now, why companies want just in time is because it's a cost for them to have the building holding material. It costs them. Well, if you want to be on a war footing, you say, okay, we will give you a tax credit for you to stock strategic materials that we know we will need. So we'll move away.
Yeah, I would say I suspect there's also, back to Dina's mention of consumer behavior, we have to be cognizant of our role in driving down prices. We don't want to pay a lot for things. I want strawberries all year long for $3.99 a pound. Well, you have to do things to make that happen, okay?
Yes.
And so there are choices, different choices that consumers have to make if they want more secure supply chains as well.
Yes, and I think the other issue is we're going to have to make choices about global warming.
Yeah.
And this production is going to also may have an impact on how we understand and getting control of the production of carbon. Will the smaller production be a much more effective way for us to save the planet? Would be another interesting issue.
And very much in the same way that pre 9/11, we viewed adversaries through one lens. Post 9/11, we viewed them in a very different way. And I think pre-COVID, we viewed the prospect of pandemic and how we'd respond to it in one way. And now that we're living it, we're going to take away that plan.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our amazing speakers today, Dina and Harvey. Join us next Thursday at 2:30. Another amazing topic that's very relevant. It'll be parenting and technology and a pandemic. Vivian Schiller and Stephen Balcom will be our speakers. Thank you so much from the Aspen Institute Socrates program.